Korean Mafia Boss gave away his baby daughter 25 years later. She saved his life without knowing. It would later be confirmed that the woman who saved Cha Do-hyun's life on the night of the November Foundation Gala was not, by any measure a hospital admissions clerk could verify, a stranger to him, though neither of them would understand that fact for another 61 minutes, and neither of them would believe it for another 9 days, and neither of them, in the long arithmetic of what remained of their lives, would ever quite recover from the moment of believing. The 72nd floor of the Signal Seoul had been swept 4 times that evening by men whose suits cost more than the rooms they were standing in. 280 guests, 41 waiters, 12 members of the Daegun Brotherhood positioned along the perimeter, the way punctuation is positioned in a sentence, visible only to those who already knew the grammar. The chairman of Hanseo Pharmaceuticals stood near the window with a glass of Hueo 41 he had poured, but not yet tasted. A retired Supreme Court justice laughed a half-second too long at something the Deputy Minister of Justice had not quite said. Somewhere on the floor, a string quartet was working its way through the second movement of a Brahms piece nobody could name and everybody recognized. And Cha Do-hyun, 51 years old, the most quietly feared man in the southern half of the peninsula, was holding a small white plate of John he had no intention of eating, listening to a politician describe his grandson's tennis lessons, and thinking, for reasons he could not have explained to any man alive, about the precise weight of a baby he had not held in 25 years. The gun came up from the third table on the left, held by a man whose face Cha Do-hyun would not afterward remember, and would not, in any case, try to. The plate left his hand before the sound reached his ears. He felt the shot the way a man feels rain begin, first as temperature, then as fact, then as something already too late to argue with. Behind him, the chairman of Hanseo dropped his glass, and the Huayo spread across the marble in a shape that, in the security footage reviewed 48 hours later by a man who had been trained not to see meaning in accidents, would look uncannily like the silhouette of a sleeping child. 279 people ran toward the doors. One ran toward him. She was not tall. She wore a dark green dress that had clearly been altered by hand at the hem, the stitches close and patient, and slightly uneven in the way that betrays a person who had taught herself to sew because no one had been there to teach her. Her braids were tied back with a length of black ribbon, and the only piece of jewelry on her body was a thin silver bracelet on her right wrist, so small it could only have once belonged to a child. She knelt on the marble beside him without hesitation, pressed her left palm to the wound below his collarbone with the calm that belongs to someone who has been trained by hardship before she was ever trained by hospitals, and said in Korean, clean enough to suggest she had learned it slowly and on purpose, that he needed to keep his eyes open and that an ambulance was already on the way. He registered her voice before he registered her face. The voice was the thing that opened the room inside him he had spent 25 years bricking shut, one brick at a time, on the side of himself that faced the light. His name was Cha Do-hyun, and he had not cried in front of another human being since the spring of 2001. He did not cry now, but his throat moved twice before he could find the breath to ask her name, and when she answered, "Aduni," she said then, after a small hesitation, the kind of hesitation a person performs in front of a name she has carried without permission. Cha Aduni, he understood, in a way he could not yet have proven to anyone, that the bullet had not been the most important thing that had happened to him that night. The bullet had been the thing that finally made him look down. To understand what happened on the 72nd floor of the Signal Seoul, you have to go back 25 years and 7 months to an apartment in Mapo-gu that no longer exists in the form Cha Do-hyun remembers it, in a building that has since been demolished and replaced by a 14-story mixed-use development whose lobby is decorated with a single black-and-white photograph of the neighborhood as it looked the year the apartment was torn down. He keeps a copy of that photograph in the top drawer of his desk. He does not look at it. He only needs to know it is there. He was 26 then. He was not yet anyone the chairman of Hanseo would have shaken hands with in public. The Dagon Brotherhood was, at that point, a loose collection of men from the same neighborhood in Incheon who had agreed, more or less, that Cha Do-hyun's judgment was sound and that his temper was the kind that protected other people instead of itself. He was rising. He was not yet risen. There is a difference, and the difference is the difference between a man with one enemy and a man with 11. He met her in a small bookstore on a side street in Hongdae in the autumn of 1999. She had come to Seoul on a teaching scholarship from Lagos and had stayed because the city, she said, had a quietness inside its noise that she had never found anywhere else in the world and had stopped believing existed. Her name was Folake Adebayo. She was 24. She read 4 languages and spoke 3 of them well and apologized for the 4th as if she had committed a small theft against it. She laughed the way a person laughs who has decided, in some earlier room of her life, that laughter is a discipline and not a reflex. She wore her hair in long braids and a thin silver bracelet on her right wrist that had belonged to her mother and her mother's mother, and she told Cha Do-hyun, the 3rd time they met, looking at him across a small table in a tea house off Yonsei Row, that she did not date men whose work she did not understand. He told her his work the 4th time they met. He told her all of it. He had never told anyone all of it before. He has never told anyone all of it since. She did not leave. She set her cup down and looked at him for a long time, and then she said, very quietly, that everyone in the world is born into a circumstance they did not choose, and that the only honest question is what a person decides to do inside the circumstance once they understand it. She said she would not lie for him. She said she would not be ashamed of him either. She said she would cook for him on the nights he came home before midnight, and she would lock the door on the nights he did not, and that he would have to decide every single morning which kind of night he was going to give her. They married in the spring of 2000 in a small ceremony at a Buddhist temple in Yangju that her sunbaenim at the language school had recommended for its plum trees. His mother bowed to Folake at 30 degrees, and then, after a moment of consideration that lasted exactly the length of one indrawn breath, at 45. Folak bowed back at 45 and held the bow 1 full second longer than was required, and Cha Do-hyun's mother, who had not approved of her son's life since he was 19, took Folak's hand in both of hers and said, in Korean too quiet for the photographer to hear, that a woman who knew how to bow was a woman who knew how to stand, and that her son, who had forgotten the second, had been sent the first. The child was born on the 11th of October, 2000, at Severance Hospital in Sinchon, at 4:12 in the morning, in a delivery room on the 7th floor whose window faced east. They named her Cha Aduni Hae-in. Folake had chosen Aduni, sweet to find, in Yoruba, and Cha Do-hyun had chosen Hae-in, grace of the sea. The nurses laughed and said it was the longest name on the floor that month and the longest name they had written that year, and that the child would grow into it the way a small house grows into the land it is built on. Cha Do-hyun held his daughter for 31 minutes before he let anyone else touch her. He counted the minutes. He had not counted anything in his life before. He has counted everything since. The threat arrived 11 days later. It came as a photograph, slid under the door of the Mapo apartment at 9:47 p.m. on the 22nd of October. The photograph showed the entrance of Severance Hospital. The photograph showed the 7th floor. The photograph showed the window of the delivery room. Across the bottom, in a hand he did not recognize and would not ever, in 25 years of looking, succeed in identifying, someone had written, in Korean, "We know which one is yours." He went to his lieutenant that night. The lieutenant's name was Im Seung-ho, and Cha Do-hyun had known him since they were both 15 years old, and had shared a single pair of work gloves between them on the night shift at a fish market in Incheon. Im Seung-ho had stood beside him at the temple in Yangju. Im Seung-ho had held the child for 4 of the 31 minutes and had counted them too, out loud, the way an uncle counts. Im Seung-ho listened to the story of the photograph with his hand around a small porcelain cup of doenjang jjigae that his wife had made that morning. And when Cha Do-hyun was finished, Im Seung-ho set the cup down very carefully, as if the cup were the thing in the room that could most easily break, and said that there was a family he knew of in Busan. Quiet people, decent people, a couple who could not have children of their own. And that for a sum that Cha Do-hyun could afford to send every month for the rest of the child's life, the child could be placed somewhere no enemy would ever think to look. He said it would be temporary. He said it would be 3 years, perhaps 4. He said that when the brotherhood was secure, the child would come home and that Folake would forgive him, because she was the kind of woman who understood circumstance. Cha Do-hyun wired 300 million won, 300 million won, to an account in Busan on the morning of the 3rd of November, 2000. He kissed his daughter on the forehead at 6:14 that evening, twice, once for her and once for the man he would never again be after he closed the door, and he gave her, tucked into the inside fold of her blanket, the thin silver bracelet his wife had taken off her own wrist and placed in his hand without a word, without a question, without ever asking him where the child was going or why she was being asked to send her own grandmother's silver into the dark. He did not tell Folek. He told her, instead, that the child had stopped breathing in the night. He arranged a small funeral. He arranged a small urn. He arranged a small grave at a cemetery in Paju that Folake visited every Sunday for 4 months before she stopped speaking to him. And then, for 2 more months after that, before she left the apartment in Mapo and the country of Korea and the man she had married and disappeared, he would later learn into a teaching post in Abidjan that no one in Seoul had the reach to trace. The last thing she said to him in the doorway of the Mapo apartment on the 17th of March, 2001, with one suitcase at her feet and the silver of her wrist no longer there, was, "A man who lies to protect you is still a man who lies. Remember which one you chose to be." If you have felt anything at all in the last 7 minutes, anything that moved without your permission, take one breath and subscribe to Korean Mafia Boss before we go further. What is about to happen across the next 20 minutes will rearrange your understanding of what a father is, what a daughter owes, and what 25 years of a single signature does to a man who built an empire on the wrong side of it. Stay with me. You will want to be in the room for what comes next. The door is not closed yet. Im Seung-ho did not place the child with the family in Busan. The family in Busan did not exist. the family in Busan had never existed. The wire of 300 million won arrived in an account that had been opened in the name of a woman who had been dead for 2 years, and the child was handed on the night of the 3rd of November in the back room of a gas station outside Daejeon at 23 minutes past 1 in the morning to a woman who ran an unlicensed home for unwanted children in exchange for an envelope containing 1/10 of the wire's value. The remaining 9/10 paid for a black Mercedes-Maybach S680, a small house in Pyeongchang-dong with a garden of red maples that turned the color of arterial blood every October, and a Patek Philippe Calatrava that Im Seung-ho would wear for the next 24 years on the wrist he raised every time he toasted his Hyungnim's health. The child was renamed Adunni by the woman in Daejeon, who could not pronounce Hai-in and did not try, and who could not, in any case, have known that half the name was missing. The bracelet was not taken from her. The woman who ran the home was a thief, but not a cruel one, and she knew the difference between a thing a child wore and a thing a child owned. She kept the bracelet on the child's wrist until the child was old enough to keep it on herself, and she told the child when she was 7 and asked that the bracelet had come from her mother and that her mother had loved her, and that the rest of the story was not hers to tell and would have to be found, if the child wanted it, on the child's own legs. The child grew up in 2 rooms above a dry cleaner's in a part of Daejeon that no tourist had ever photographed and no city planner had ever quite finished planning. She learned Korean from the television and English from a missionary who came to the home on Saturdays with sweets in his coat pocket, and Yoruba from a woman 3 doors down who had married a Korean welder in 1994 and who recognized the first time she heard the child's name spoken aloud in the hallway that someone in the child's past had been from a place she remembered the smell of. She was a quiet child. She was a clever child. She read every book in the small public library on Jeongang-ro twice, and the librarian, who had no children of her own, began to set books aside for her on a low shelf marked with the child's name in pencil. At 14, she won a national essay competition on the subject of kindness and was given a scholarship to a high school in Seoul that the woman in Daejeon walked her to the train for, holding her hand to the platform and letting it go only when the doors closed. At 19, she was admitted to the College of Nursing at Seoul National University. At 23, she graduated at the top of her class. At 24, she took a position as a trauma nurse at Asan Medical Center in Songpa on the 14th floor, in the ward that handles the patients no one else can stabilize, and that the rest of the hospital walks around the way the rest of a city walks around a hospital. She had never asked the woman in Daejeon for the rest of the story. The woman had died when Adunni was 21, of an illness she had hidden, the way she hid everything that might have asked the children in her care to carry her, and the rest of the story had died with her. And Adunni had decided, on the train back from the funeral with the woman's reading glasses folded in her coat pocket, that a person could be whole without an origin if they were careful about what they chose to carry forward. She kept the bracelet. She kept her name. She kept a small photograph of herself at 3 years old, the only one that had survived the years above the dry cleaners, in which she was holding the bracelet up to the camera and laughing at something the photographer had said in a language she could not now remember. She lived in a 1-bedroom apartment in Mapogu. She had not chosen the neighborhood for any reason she could have explained, and the neighborhood had not asked her to. And she paid her own rent and cooked her own food and told no one at the hospital that she had been raised in a home for unwanted children because she had decided, at 17, in the back row of a high school classroom in Seoul, that her past was not a credential and not a wound, but a private room she would enter on her own terms or not at all. She had been invited to the November Foundation Gala because Asen had been given 2 seats, and the head of trauma had given one of them to her in recognition of a paper she had published in the Korean Journal of Emergency Medicine on the management of penetrating chest trauma in the field. She had almost not gone. She had almost said the dress was wrong, the night was long, the shift was early, and any of a dozen things that were true and were not the reason. She had gone because her mentor had said, very kindly, over coffee in the staff lounge on a Tuesday, that a young woman who refused every room she had earned the right to enter would eventually forget that she had earned it, and that the forgetting was the cost. She had worn the green dress because it was the only formal dress she owned, and because her mother in Daejeon, the only mother she had known, had once told her that green was the color of the side of a thing that was still alive. She had tied her braids back with the ribbon because the ribbon had belonged to the woman in Daejeon. She had worn the bracelet because she always wore the bracelet. She had never heard the name Cha Do-hyun before she knelt beside him on the marble of the 72nd floor. She had heard, on a late-night podcast once, half listening while she folded laundry, the name of the Daegun Brotherhood, in the way one hears the name of a weather system one does not live inside and is grateful not to. She did not know whose blood was on her left palm. She knew only that the man on the floor had a pulse she could keep, and that no one else in the room, not the men in the perimeter suits, not the chairman of Hanseo, not the retired Supreme Court Justice, was going to keep it for him. He woke at 3:11 in the morning in a private suite on the 11th floor of Asan Medical Center. The Patek Philippe his wife had once given him, the original, not the one his lieutenant wore, was on the bedside table beside a glass of water no one had drunk from. The Patek had stopped at 9:47 the night before. The second its crystal had taken the shock of his fall. He did not look at the watch. He looked at the chair beside the bed, where the trauma nurse who had walked in with him from the ambulance bay was asleep, her left hand still resting on the rail of his bed, the way a hand rests on the rail of a bed when its owner has decided, somewhere below thinking, not to leave. He looked at her wrist. He looked at the bracelet on her wrist. He looked at the bracelet for a long time, for so long that the night nurse making her rounds in the corridor passed his door 3 times and did not look in. He had given a bracelet exactly like it to a daughter he had buried at 4 months old. He had not seen another like it in 25 years. He had told himself for 25 years that there was no other like it. His wife's grandmother had made it by hand in a village in the south of Nigeria in 1947, by lamplight, the year her first child was born. His wife had told him there were 2 in the world. Her mother had been buried with the first. He did not wake her. He looked at her face, at the way the corner of her mouth moved when she breathed, at the small scar on her left eyebrow that he could not place and yet could not stop looking at, the kind of scar a child gets from the corner of a low table she has not yet learned to walk around. And he understood. The way a man understands a thing he has spent a quarter of a century preparing not to understand, that the woman asleep in the chair was not a stranger, and that the man he had trusted most in the world had lied to him in the autumn of 2000, and that the cost of that lie was the entirety of his life since. He did not say anything. He closed his eyes. He pretended to sleep until she woke, 3 hours later, checked his vitals with the soft competence of a person who had done it 10,000 times and would do it 10,000 more, told him she was going home to shower and would return for the afternoon shift, and left without asking him a single question about who he was, or what he did, or why three men in identical dark suits had taken up positions at the end of the corridor while he slept. That, more than anything else, was what broke him. She had saved his life without wanting anything from him. She had sat beside him for 6 hours without checking his name on the chart. He waited until the door closed. He waited until the corridor outside was quiet. Then he reached for the phone on the bedside table and called a man named Ju Ha-jun, who had been his private investigator since 2003, and he said only, "There is a nurse on the 14th floor of this hospital. Her name is Cha Aduni. I want her entire life on my desk by Friday. Every document, every address, every photograph that exists of her between the ages of 0 and 4. I want to know who raised her. I want to know who paid for it. I want to know what she was called the first night she slept under a roof I did not buy. And I want to know it before Im Seung-ho knows I am asking." He met her in the sub-basement parking garage of Asan Medical Center on the evening of the 9th day after the shooting. He had asked her, through a note left at the nurse's station folded twice and sealed with no name, if she would do him the courtesy of one conversation. Away from the suite, away from the hospital staff, away from the men in dark suits who had begun since the shooting, to stand at both ends of every corridor she walked, in a way she had pretended for 9 days not to notice. She had agreed because she was curious, and because the note had been written by hand, and because the handwriting had reminded her, the first time her eye crossed it, of something she could not name and did not feel safe naming alone in her apartment at midnight. He was waiting beside a black Mercedes Maybach he had ordered the driver to leave, parked and walk away from. He was alone. He had asked his security detail to remain on the floor above, with strict instructions not to descend for any reason short of fire. He was wearing a gray overcoat and the Patek Philippe that had stopped at 9:47 on the night of the gala, which he had not had repaired, and would never have repaired, because he had decided on the morning of the 3rd day that there were some clocks a man should not restart, and some hours a man should be made to carry on his wrist for the rest of his life. He told her, without preamble, standing in the cold electric light of the parking garage with no chair to sit in and no table to set anything on, that he believed she was his daughter. He told her about the photograph slid under the door in October of 2000. He told her about the wire transfer of 300 million won. He told her the name of the man he had trusted with her life, and the name of the woman he had married, and the name he had given the child before he had given her away. He told her about the funeral and the urn and the grave in Paju, that he had visited every Sunday for 8 years before he had stopped, because he had begun to understand that a man who visits a grave he is not certain holds. His daughter is not mourning, he is hoping, and hope, in his line of work, was the most dangerous thing a man could be caught carrying. He told her he could be wrong. He told her there were tests. He told her that whether or not she ever spoke to him again, whether or not she ever wanted to know him, whether or not the test came back the way he believed it would, he had needed her to hear the story from his own mouth because she had spent 25 years not knowing it, and he had spent 25 years not telling it, and one of the two of them had to break first, and it was not going to be her. She listened the way a trauma nurse listens to a patient's family in a small room off the corridor. Without interruption, without comfort, she had not yet earned the right to offer, without taking her eyes off the face of the person speaking. She did not weep. She held the silver bracelet between her fingers while he spoke, turning it slowly the way a person turns a key inside a lock she has not yet decided whether to open. When he was finished, she looked at him for a long time, long enough that the fluorescent light overhead clicked once and steadied, and then she said quietly, "I do not yet know what I am going to do with this. I am going to tell you now 3 things. Phase 1. I will take the test. I will take it at a hospital you do not own a piece of, with a chain of custody I select, on a sample I draw myself, and I will read the result before you do. Phase 2. If the result is what you believe it is, you will not call me your daughter to anyone, not your men, not your associates, not the press, not the man you trusted, until I tell you that you may. The name on my hospital badge is the only name I have earned. I will decide when and whether I am ready to be called by another one. Phase 3. Whatever happened to my mother, wherever she is, whatever she became, whether she is alive or whether she is not, you will tell me everything you know and everything you suspect, and you will help me find her if she can be found. And you will accept in advance, before I lift a finger, that her forgiveness is not yours to negotiate and was never yours to assume. Those are the conditions. There are no others. There will be no others. He bowed to her at 45 degrees in the sub-basement of Asan Medical Center, between the painted yellow lines of a parking space marked for staff. He held the bow for 4 full seconds. He said, quietly, into the floor, "I accept." She did not help him up. She did not need to. He rose on his own. The test came back on a Tuesday. She read it first, in the passenger seat of her own car in a clinic parking lot in Seongbuk-dong. She had chosen because she had never been there before, and because the clinic had no name she recognized on any list of any kind. She drove from the clinic to the small office above the Daegun Brotherhood's old warehouse in Incheon, where she had asked him to be alone, and she handed him the envelope across his desk without sitting down. He opened it with hands that were perfectly steady and read it with eyes that were not. He set it down on the desk. He looked at the wall behind her for a long moment, long enough that she counted the seconds the way she counted them at a bedside. Then he reached for the phone and called Im Seong-ho and told him, in a voice no one in the Brotherhood had heard him use in 20 years, and no one alive would hear him use again, that there would be a private dinner that Friday at the small Hanok restaurant in Bukchon, that the dinner would be for 2, and that Im Seong-ho should bring with him every document, every photograph, every receipt, and every transfer record relating to the placement of a child in Busan on the 3rd of November, 2000. He said, "Bring all of it." He said, "Do not forget anything." He said, "I will know." Im Seong-ho arrived at the Hanok in Bukchon at 7:11 p.m. on a Friday in March. He was wearing the Patek Philippe Calatrava he had purchased with money that had not been his and had worn for so long that the tan line beneath it had become, in some sense, the truest document on his body. He was 62 years old, and his hair had gone the color of cold ash, and his hands had begun, in the last year, to tremble very slightly when he poured tea, the way the hands of old men begin to tell on them what their faces have not yet agreed to admit. He sat across from Cha Do-hyun in the small private room with the rice paper doors closed, and he poured the first cup of barley tea for his hyungnim, the way he had poured the first cup for 24 years, and Cha Do-hyun let him pour it, and let him set the kettle down, and let him fold his hands in his lap, and let the silence sit between them, the way a third man sits between 2 who can no longer look at each other, and then said very quietly, "Did she ever cash the check?" Im Seong-ho's right hand closed around the rim of his own cup until the knuckles went the color of old paper. "There was no woman in Busan," Cha Do-hyun said. "There was no family. There was a woman in Daejeon who took a tenth of the money and raised the child above a dry cleaner's. And there was a Patek Philippe on your wrist that I bought without knowing I was buying it. And there was a grave in Paju I visited for 8 years. That does not hold what I believed it held. And there was a wife who left me because the lie I told her to protect her was a lie I had been told by you. I am not going to ask you why. I have known the answer for 9 days. You wanted what I had, and you did not know how to ask for it. And somewhere inside you, in a room you had not finished building when we were 15, and shared one pair of gloves between us, you believed that if the child was gone, the woman would leave, and if the woman left, the empire would be yours to inherit when the time came. You were wrong about the empire. You were wrong about the woman. You were wrong about the child. And the only thing you were right about was that I would not look at you closely enough to see it, because I trusted you the way a man trusts his own hand. I will not be making that mistake again. I do not have another hand to lose. He laid 3 documents on the table between them, one at a time, the way a man lays cards he has already won with. The first was the original wire transfer of 300 million won, with the receiving account flagged in red. The second was a photograph taken in 2003 by a private investigator Im Seung-ho had never known about and would never afterward forgive himself for not having suspected, of Im Seung-ho leaving a dealership in Gangnam beside a black Mercedes Maybach he had no legitimate income to afford. The third was a letter, written by hand on lined paper that had yellowed at the edges, signed by the woman in Daejeon 4 months before her death, in which she named Im Seung-ho as the man who had handed her the child and the envelope on the night of the 3rd of November, 2000. She had kept the letter in a tin box under her bed for 17 years, beneath a photograph of a child she had raised and a small jade comb she had not been able to afford. Ju Ha-jun had found it on the 2nd day. Cha Do-hyun did not raise his voice. He did not have to. He told Im Seung-ho that the signing authority over the Brotherhood's accounts had been revoked at 4:12 that afternoon, the same minute to the hour that the child had been born on the 7th floor of Severance. A coincidence Im Seung-ho would understand only later in a smaller room, alone. He told Im Seung-ho that the house in Pyeongchang-dong had been transferred by court order into a trust whose sole beneficiary was a charitable foundation. Cha Do-hyun had quietly established the previous Tuesday in his daughter's chosen name to fund the education of children raised in unlicensed homes across the southern provinces. He told Im Seung-ho that the Patek on his wrist was, by the original purchase record, the property of the Brotherhood, and that he expected it on the table before Im Seung-ho left the room. He told Im Seung-ho that the Brotherhood's council had been convened for the following Monday, that the letter from the woman in Daejeon would be read aloud in full, and that the council would decide, by the protocols that had governed the Brotherhood since 1987, what was to be done with a man who had stolen a child from his hyungnim. He told Im Seung-ho that he, personally, would not be voting. He told Im Seung-ho that he would not need to. Im Seung-ho took off the Patek Philippe and laid it on the table between them, on top of the letter from the woman in Daejeon, so that the watch covered her name. His right hand was shaking. He looked across the table at the man he had betrayed, and he said, in a voice that was not steady and that he did not try to steady, "I did not know she would leave you. I thought she would stay." "A man who lies to protect you," Cha Do-hyun said, "is still a man who lies. Remember which one you chose to be." He did not see Im Seung-ho again. On day 11, after the dinner at the Hanok in Bukchon, He stood in the lobby of Asan Medical Center at 6:47 p.m. on a Wednesday, with a small bag of pears from a market in Mapo, the kind his wife had bought every Wednesday in the autumn of 2000, because the man who sold them had taught her the Korean word for each variety. He did not go upstairs. He left the pears at the nurse's station on the 14th floor with a note that said only, "I was here. I will be here next Wednesday. You do not have to come down." He came back every Wednesday for 40 weeks. He did not, in any of those 40 weeks, go upstairs. On day 23, he sat at the back of a public lecture at Seoul National University on field management of penetrating thoracic trauma, given by a young trauma nurse named Cha Aduni. He arrived after the lights had dimmed. He left before they came back up. He did not speak to her. He did not need to. She had seen him come in. He had seen her see him. The lecture was, in some way, neither of them ever spoke about afterward, the first hour they had ever spent in the same room as father and daughter, while both of them knew it. On day 41, she called him for the first time. She asked him if he had eaten. He said he had not. She said there was a small place in Mapo that did a doenjang jjigae her landlady's mother had taught the owner to make in 1994, and that if he wanted to drive himself, without a car behind him and without a man at the door, she would meet him there at 8. He drove himself. He had not driven himself anywhere in 19 years. He arrived at 7:43. He waited outside in the cold until 8 exactly. They sat across from each other in a 4-table restaurant with a calendar from a local pharmacy on the wall and a cat asleep on a sack of rice in the doorway, and they ate doenjang jjigae with anchovy broth out of small black stone bowls, and she asked him, halfway through the meal, without setting her spoon down, "What was my mother like?" He told her. He told her for an hour and a half. He did not embellish. He did not romanticize. He told her about the bookstore in Hongdae and the bow at the temple in Yangju, and the 31 minutes in the delivery room at Severance, and the last sentence in the doorway of the Mapo apartment on the 17th of March, 2001. He told her the Yoruba word her mother had taught him for the first light of morning, which he had not used in 25 years and had not, in 25 years, forgotten. She listened. She did not cry. At the end she said, "I would like to find her. I am not asking you to come with me. I am telling you that I am going to do it, and that when I have done it, I will tell you what she said." He bowed at 30 degrees across the small black stone bowls. He said, "Whenever you are ready, whatever she decides, whatever she does not." She found Folake Adebayo 7 months later, in a small apartment on the 3rd floor of a building in Abidjan, whose stairwell smelled of cardamom and rain, where she had been teaching Korean and English literature at a private school for 18 years, to children who called her Madame and meant it. The conversation between mother and daughter is not mine to narrate. It lasted 4 days. It ended with Folak holding her daughter's right wrist in both her hands and turning the silver bracelet around it 3 times, the way her own grandmother had turned it around her mother's wrist on the day she was named. It ended with Folaka saying, in Korean, she had not spoken aloud in 25 years and had thought she had lost and was surprised, when she opened her mouth, to find she had not, that a circumstance was something a person was born into, and that the only honest question was what a person decided to do once they understood it. It ended with Folek agreeing, on her own terms and on no one else's, to meet the man she had married once in a public place in Seoul, on a date she would choose, with her daughter present, and to decide nothing in advance about what came after. That meeting when it happened, in a tea house near Gyeongbokgung on a Tuesday afternoon in October, was not the end of the story. The end of the story was smaller. The end of the story was a photograph. It was taken in the kitchen of the one-bedroom apartment in Mapo-gu, where Cha Aduni had lived for 4 years. It was taken by a friend of hers on a film camera that had belonged to the friend's father on a Sunday afternoon, the autumn after the trip to Abidjan, with the window open and the light coming in low and amber across the table. In the photograph, 3 people are sitting around a small table. A doenjang jjigae is on the table between them, in a small black stone pot still steaming. Folake Adebayo is on the left, in a yellow blouse, her hands around a cup of barley tea, her braids longer now and threaded with gray. Cha Aduni is in the middle, laughing at something her mother has just said. Cha Do-hyun is on the right, in a gray sweater she had bought him because the gray overcoats had begun to feel, to her, like a uniform she did not want him to wear in her kitchen. Looking at his daughter the way a man looks at a window he has waited 25 years to open, and is afraid, even now, to lean too close to. The Patek Philippe is not on his wrist. His wrist is bare. On the small shelf behind him, propped against a cookbook in his wife's handwriting that his daughter had carried home from Abidjan in her suitcase, is a piece of paper on which Cha Aduni has written, in her own hand, 3 lines. The first line is in Korean. It reads, "우리는 다시 시작하지 않는다. 우리는 처음으로 시작한다. We do not begin again. We begin for the first time." The second line is in English. It reads, "The man who saved my life is the man who took it from me first." We have decided what to do with that. The third line is in Yoruba. It reads, "Omo ti asonu ko sonu mo." The child who was lost is no longer lost. A boy buries a child he believes he has saved and pours himself a drink alone in a dark room. A man, 25 years later, buries the lie he told to bury the child and pours barley tea slowly into the cup of the woman who came back across an ocean to drink it with him. If you were Cha Do-hyun, if you had spent 25 years searching for a daughter you had given away to save, only to find that the man who had taken her had stolen her from you the same night you handed her over, would you have told her the whole story in a parking garage on day 9, or would you have waited until you had earned a softer room to tell it in? Leave your answer in the comments. I read them. I always do. If this story moved something in you that needed moving, subscribe to Korean Mafia Boss and turn the bell on, so the next one finds you the night it goes up, in the room you are already sitting in. A father is not the man who is in the room when the child is born. A father is the man who is still in the room, 25 years later, on the night the child decides whether the room is worth letting him stay in.